We're fighting a global conflict where one system is trying to change the other system. It deals with gaining the objectives short of nuclear war by the various themes that it promulgates. What I call a wilderness of mirrors. They can have you believe whatever they desire you to believe.
In the annals of rock and roll lore, few tales match the eerie and enduring enigma of the Paul is Dead conspiracy. It's a story that's persisted for over half a century, woven into the fabric of one of the most iconic bands in history, the Beatles. This legend posits a chilling scenario. Paul McCartney, the charismatic bassist and co-lead vocalist of the Beatles, died in 1966 and was replaced by a lookalike. The roots of this urban legend trace back to 1966. It was an era of Beatlemania, where the Fab Four not only dominated the charts, but also the collective consciousness of the youth. The rumor, seemingly born out of thin air, began its eerie whisper across college campuses and into the mainstream media by September 1969. Central to this bewildering theory was a specific tragic event, Paul McCartney's death in a car crash. According to the lore, this catastrophic event claimed McCartney's life, setting the stage for one of the most enigmatic tales in music history. In an effort to shield the public from the immense grief this news would surely cause, the surviving Beatles, purportedly with the assistance of Britain's MI5, embarked on a covert operation to replace McCartney with a look-alike. This extraordinary claim transformed the way fans listened to the Beatles' music and viewed their album covers. Clues were allegedly embedded in these elements, suggesting the truth about McCartney's fate. Enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists meticulously analyzed lyrics and scrutinized cover art, convinced that the band was communicating the dark secret through subtle, cryptic messages. By October 1969, this pursuit of hidden truths had escalated beyond a mere hobby for a few curious fans. It became an international phenomenon, captivating Beatles enthusiasts across the globe. People delved into the band's discography with an almost forensic attention to detail, seeking out any hint or symbol that could be linked to the supposed car crash and McCartney's replacement. This global fascination highlighted not just the enduring impact of the Beatles, but also the allure of mystery and the compelling nature of collective myths. The Paul is Dead conspiracy, fueled by the tragic imagery of McCartney's alleged car crash, wove itself into the very fabric of Beatles lore, becoming an unforgettable chapter in the saga of the world's most famous rock band.
Good evening. Welcome to Unwitting Assets, and today we ask a question. Did Paul McCartney die in the year 1966? Now, this is a fascinating journey. Some of you may have heard of it. If you haven't, we're going to break it down. A wonderful friend is here as a guest, Clare Kuehn, and she's an independent journalist, and she's looked at many subjects, but this is the one dear to her heart. And myself as well, we have both written about this subject, so just enjoy as we give you a brief introduction to this fascinating rabbit hole. Hello, Claire. How are you?
I'm pretty well, James. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. And I wanted to ask you if we could open this discussion with a brief prayer.
Absolutely.
Do you have anything in mind?
Yes, you have the...
Yeah, I'll play that. Okay, everybody listen and enjoy the visuals and consider this a contemplative space right now. blessing this day that everybody listening, Claire and myself, always live in the light of truth. And I say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you for sharing that beautiful music, Claire. It's very, I'm feeling it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So you are very knowledgeable about the Beatles, Paul McCartney, all of them. And to people that are not familiar with this, let's just give them a little sense that this was a moment in history that this became a very trending topic, and it's always fascinated people ever since, and we'll explain the reason why. So I'm going to share this little clip.
In the annals of rock and roll lore, few tales match the eerie and enduring enigma of the Paul is dead conspiracy. It's a story that's persisted for over half a century, woven into the fabric of one of the most iconic bands in history, the Beatles. This legend posits a chilling scenario. Paul McCartney, the charismatic bassist and co-lead vocalist of the Beatles, died in 1966 and was replaced by a lookalike. The roots of this urban legend trace back to 1966. It was an era of Beatlemania, where the Fab Four not only dominated the charts, but also the collective consciousness of the youth. The rumor, seemingly born out of thin air, began its eerie whisper across college campuses and into the mainstream media by September 1969. Central to this bewildering theory was a specific tragic event, Paul McCartney's death in a car crash. According to the lore, this catastrophic event claimed McCartney's life, setting the stage for one of the most enigmatic tales in music history. In an effort to shield the public from the immense grief this news would surely cause, the surviving Beatles, purportedly with the assistance of Britain's MI5, embarked on a covert operation to replace McCartney with a look-alike. This extraordinary claim transformed the way fans listened to the Beatles' music and viewed their album covers. Clues were...
Hello. Oh, I might have hit a button there, but it's so wonderful to talk with you again after all these years, Claire. And I'm going through my own book, and I actually reference you. Do you want me to read what I say?
I guess you can.
It's part of the argument for military intelligence. Clare Kuehn, an intrepid researcher and PID expert who has studied the case for many years, may have connected the death of Paul McCartney to the assassination of JFK. According to Mark Lane's autobiography, the Beatles, and particularly Paul, were very interested in the assassination, and Paul McCartney even expressed an interest in composing music for Mark Lane's documentary, Rush to Judgment. Whether this is true or not, I cannot confirm. That's honesty. But if it was, Paul McCartney would be one of the hundreds to make the infamous hit list the author Richard Belzer writes about in his best-selling book that chronicles the scores of people to die as a result of that terrible assassination. So, Claire, welcome, and I'll pass the baton over to you. And it's just a great synchronicity that we are connected through arts and letters and books and the Beatles. It's good to have you.
Thank you so much, James. First of all, my apologies that my camera isn't working for the folks at home. Well, that was a fairly good little intro thing that you played, although you hit the button.
Oh, I'm sorry. What happened when I hit the button? Because I was looking at the book at that moment.
Hey, we're leaving it up to God to do whatever He wants.
I like that.
Yeah.
The idea that we own everything we do, including our mistakes.
Yeah.
So take us. How would you begin this journey, or your particular take on it for listeners?
Well, that's a good question. It kind of depends whether one is speaking personally with someone or doing it publicly, as we're doing, right? A small correction is that I did not come up with, I try to be very honest, I did not come up with the JFK connection thing. It was running around in various blog site or forums, right? Fora. And it was talked about quite a bit by Tina Foster, who is a well-known person who's now written a book on the subject. And it is very probable that was a major factor, if not the factor, that might have convinced a bunch of people to have him murdered. Okay. So the
Were they both
official,
Catholic? I know JFK was Catholic. What about Paul McCartney?
yes, officially Paul was Catholic. Now, to what degree he was faithful or anything like that, who knows, right? But his mother was, and his father basically brought him up whatever the mother had wanted on that score. So we know that he would have attended mass, and and so would George Harrison. And so back to your first question, how would we approach this with different people? A friend of mine goes to her friends and says, hey, look, is this the same person? Right? And shows pictures. Sometimes it comes up in conversations where people are talking about, quote unquote, that crazy idea, or they've seen something, or they remember it from the 70s, maybe when they would have heard of it, or they saw something on the internet. Or so you really have to, on an individual level, always, of course, with anything, take the person and work with them. Sorry, I thought you were about to say something. But on a public level, one can go through an overview. What is the thesis? When did it supposedly show up in the historical record? How serious is one when one is speaking? Like, I know the case really, really well. Other people might speak on this and overdo it. They speak on things they don't yet know about and might misrepresent something. And as you probably know, when you misrepresent something in a controversial subject, if someone finds an error somewhere, they might say, hey, gotcha, gotcha moment. And that's a problem. So it can happen to anyone, but we want to know pieces of it really well and speak only about the pieces we know, and then stay open to it. So if you want me to do like a 2-minute overview of the case,
that would be perfect. Something concise, that will, for people that might be familiar and those who are not.
Okay. So as your little segment there discussed, with a little bit of a put down tone.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I have Tourette's syndrome.
Oh, do you? Tourette's of the finger.
Listen, I'm not good with the buttons tonight.
It's okay.
But I'm so sorry. Keep going.
I'm not good with getting this driver for my camera working. But anyway, the idea is that in late 1969, somehow a bunch of especially USA students might have been on drugs, had a crazy idea, were looking at things on album covers and listening to records, and for some reason, mysteriously, we're playing them backwards, which ruins records if you do it on a physical. Okay.
Ruins the needle on the, it's no good.
Yeah, I believe it ruins the vinyl.
Don't try to talk to the devil with your record player. It'll break everything.
Well, so
you shouldn't talk to the devil anyway.
Right.
While we're at
it. For some reason, they came up with the idea that Paul had died, and that there were these clues in art and music. They've since been named the Beatle clues. Now, if we're going to be honest and look at any of these ideas, we have to call them a case. We have to talk about case making. We have to understand that theory means case. Theory means explanation. It is not a bad word. You can have a good theory, bad theory, or inadequate theory. Okay. And so, to take the technical term, conspiracy theory is what this is. We are making a conspiracy theory. There is no shame in using the phrase. It actually was not made up by the CIA in 1967. It was around from the 1890s as a technical term. The CIA.
Why 1966? What supposedly happened to Paul McCartney, in your version at least anyway? What sort of brief synopsis can you give to us about what we think happened to him as opposed to what's in the current narrative right now?
Sure, I'm getting there. I just want people to have out of the way, the kinds of objections they would have. Okay, so conspiracy theory was 1890s, and in the 1960s, the CIA misused it as a put down constantly and didn't call their own theory a theory. That's the switcheroo. They had a lone nut theory. We have a conspiracy theory. If you put it that way, it's even. But if you just say conspiracy theories are junk, then you can't use the understanding and it's used against you. So this is a conspiracy theory. It is a conspiracy explanation like most of history and law. The question is it true? It's not whether it's a theory. Okay. So in 1969, as I was saying, supposedly these college students made it up. And they got on the phone to various DJs in the USA, mostly out of Detroit, New York, and also down in California, where the big hubs of music industry were at the time. And that these DJs brought it out in New York and Detroit particularly, and the whole world blew up with this nonsense. That's the basic idea of the history of this. In fact, however, it was first in a magazine that we have printed, and they did show it in your clip. They flashed it very briefly. And it was a clip saying that the Beatles supposedly had this rumor in February 1967 that in January 1967, Paul McCartney of the Beatles had a car crash, that it wasn't true. He was fine, and it happened supposedly near the M1 London motorway, and everything was crazy. Okay, so the first reference we have is actually very early, and in history, that is an important thing. How early is it attested, right? Under certain circumstances. So the idea is supposedly Paul died in late 1966, usually put around September. Some people put it November, some people October, some people August. But the general take is that it was September. There's a lot of reasons to think that. Anyway, in your little brief thing, they mentioned...
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
Many think Paul died in November as well, but Brian Epstein's announcement that the Beatles would no longer tour came in October, and it has to have been a consequence of Paul's demise. That suggests that the date is far more likely to be closer to September 11th than November 9th, the date most PID researchers believe. But people have different opinions on which date, for different reasons. That's one of those things we talked about as a thematic issue. When everything, all these competing ideas are out there, it's tough to break down what might be true. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, as I said, there's a number of ideas. The first idea was November 9th, and it was actually planted. I've never been able to find it again, but it was planted in a radio show in 1969 that Paul had died on November 9th. And it was the first time we find a reference to, I've heard it, but I can't find it now, a reference to the supposed Beatle clue that's on the Sgt. Pepper cover with the weird, it's like if you mirror various texts in the
Tourette's. Keep going. Sorry.
It's okay. We should give people the overview though, basically, because if we're going into the details of what people disagree about and where the numbers come from and what the clues are, we're going in probably too deep for this overview, right? So basically the first idea was November 9th, and then people said, but that's not British numbering in number letters. So they flipped it and said September 11th. There are now some people suggesting that it was August. There are others who said he was kidnapped in September and survived until October. So at some point, okay, and I do have a position on this, but I'm just giving an overview. At some point, he's dead. He's gone. And there is a difference between dead and gone, which some people like to peel apart and say, well, he's just gone. He's not dead. That doesn't really work, but on the surface, you can say that. So these people in 1969 were saying some point supposedly Paul isn't there, and they didn't have all the photos handy. They had these supposed clues.
I've got
But
those up on the screen right now, by the way, if you want, because I think people should see the difference, to know what you're talking about.
Okay, yeah, we should go into the photos in a bit, but the issue is that actually it was not seeded by those students. It wasn't seeded by the DJs who later said they'd actually heard it before. It was seeded at least by February 67 in England by that Beatles book magazine, where they said it didn't happen. But there was supposed to be a car crash. There was a rumor, and it was about Paul, and he'd supposedly been killed, and it was supposedly near London, but it didn't happen. That's the first actual reference we have. So if anybody is still doubting and suggesting, oh, it was these crazy college kids in 1969, even if you take it as it was planted, it was faked, it was a mistake, it was planted by the Beatles themselves through that magazine. Okay.
Can I ask you a question? I just want to hold your feet to the fire for a second. What are your strongest arguments or claims in favor of that Paul died? And I know the visual evidence is one of the more stunning ones. I can definitely hear a difference when it comes to music.
Yeah, in a big true case, there's going to be lines of argument coming from several angles. So depending on the person's proclivities, they might come at you with the music issues, or they might come at you with the visuals, or they might have read biographies.
In your opinion, take us through why we know that something happened to Paul, and you believe it was the first example of something that you'll explain to us.
Right. Well, it's all of them, literally, because every area of the case points to the same thing, and that is where you get the level of certainty and the level of interrelatedness. But the visuals are very important because, of course, people think they're seeing the same guy. And what you have to do is have a lot of photos and be very careful how you analyze them. We get into a lot of problems with people who don't recognize where there's fakery, or there's distortion, or there's some weird lighting condition, and they think you have yet another double or whatever. So you do have to understand what you're looking at. You have to feel it out, but it's in all areas. It's in the biographies. It's in the comments, both ways. It's in other people's friends, it's in the stories, in the biographies, if I already said that, it's in the visuals, it's in the manner and abilities of playing. Although Bill, who is the replacement, he can play.
Well, break that down for us. Who is Bill, or whatever his name is? You could take us through talking points from your blog if you like, but I don't want to get caught up in an epistemology of the metaphysics of our methodology, but I want listeners to know what the argument is, that they look differently, there's different heights, there's all this contextual evidence. Let's go through at least some of them just to ground people before we get into the minutia,
Right. Okay, so how do I share screen?
I'll bring it up. There you go.
Okay, so basically we do have to understand the epistemology, which is how you know what you know. And so if we get into the weeds of any one area, which is like the face, the music, what forensic scientists have said, other conspiracy cases of the big kind, murder issues, what movies are out there referencing it. We can talk about music. We can talk. Right. We can talk
Shining,
about,
I take it. Yeah.
Yeah. We can talk about faces. All of it actually fits, but it has to be tried on. So a person does have to try on the idea. I just want people to be aware it's in all areas. It's not simply one thing or another. Okay. Those might start someone's inquiry, but it's not in one area. So what I'll do is I'll go to some of the photos. I'll scroll down here. So we've got photos that are typical of Paul. I hope you can see it. Can you see?
Yeah, it was beautiful.
Yeah. Okay. I've just got to go. So we have him from different angles. Right. All right. Now,
that's original Paul.
This is Paul. If I say Paul, I mean Paul. If I say Bill, I mean the replacement. I might say Sir Paul.
We haven't even introduced Bill. Right now, there's just Paul.
Right. but I just want to be clear with people. In order to make the case, we need to begin using
They
its
need to know what the
category.
case is. The idea is something happened to Paul McCartney, whatever the minutia was. The band then hired or positioned a new person to take his place and sort of hoodwink the public because of various motives we could talk about later. But that's just the basics of it. And as a shorthand, it's often called Bill, like Billy Shears or other names, or Fall. In some cases, people use that to describe or differentiate between original Paul, who we're looking at right now, and Fall, who's like, he's got a longer face, he's a little taller. And Claire will explain the rest. But that's just the basic setup that we didn't even mention. See, that's what I meant by just the 2-minute thing. And then,
Right.
yeah.
But Fall is for fake Paul. I also say Sir Paul because it allows people to
I do
use the
too,
term.
Sir Paul, because he's a very aristocratic bastard.
Well, no, he's been knighted, and Paul was dead.
No,
so,
yeah, no, yeah.
Right. So what this allows us to do is to have two categories and still use the word Paul, because as people are getting used to the categories, they might trip up and say Paul. So if they say Sir Paul and Paul, it's easier for their mind to slide over into the new category that we're creating here, where there's Paul and there's a man named Bill. Okay. Now this is Paul. This is Paul. This is Paul. This is Paul beaten up.
What happened there? Was that the moped accident?
Yeah. Well, supposedly Paul had a moped accident. It's very clear from the circumstances, what was said about it, and the photos, that it was probably he was beaten. And so when people say that the death was an accident,
that's the creepy one.
They're all creepy. When they say the death was an accident, okay.
Wow, John Lennon really did abuse people. Bad joke.
It wouldn't have been John, okay? So there's a lot more going on in the story. And so this is Bill. This is the Sir Paul that people call Paul, okay?
He's like, hello. He's got that funny little, love songs.
Right. And you can say he's older, but the issue is, would this person, not only in shape of face, but in attitudinal nature, and so on, would he age like this? Okay. Would he be this guy? No. Okay. No. So the visual evidence is very, very important. And some visual evidence from older age is important if you know what you're doing mentally. Now,
Right.
There's also singing. There's also what's in the biographies. There's other people have said. So when you say, what would you do? First, I'd start with photos, but you have to know what you're looking at and sift them for the possibility that he died. For the possibility there's a replacement, you start sifting your evidence properly, right?
Okay, let's move. We've seen the photos. Moving beyond that, let me play devil's advocate, the traditional skeptic, and because they always say the same thing. They're like, oh, wait a second. What are the odds that you get a guy that looks exactly the same, he sings the same, and he actually writes like music as good as Paul McCartney? And they just got that all in one guy. That's usually what they say. What would you say to those skeptics?
Well, the first thing is you have to have excellent photo comparisons and no fakes, which I've just shown. So between there, you've already got, he didn't look the same. Then you're going to get the objections either switching over onto other topics, like the music, like the other people, like how would the family have
explain
known?
that, because the songwriting, if this happened in 1966, the Beatles went on to record albums afterwards. So would you make an argument that the music was different with the replacement Paul versus the guy that wrote Yesterday? Would you say original Paul wrote Yesterday?
Yes. Now there are people now claiming the Beatles didn't write their own music, but if we skip over that for the moment as a side issue right now, yes, the music is very different. You mean from Paul and Bill, or Paul and Sir Paul? It is very different.
From Paul to the replacement.
Right, because there's a general switch in the music style overall, because their manager George Martin got more involved in the writing and in the music and production
I could give you
changes.
one example. It's when they entered their psychedelic period, right? It's
That's
almost like it was
exactly.
a transformational period because everybody's dressed in funny costumes and this and that. It kind of obscures everybody. When you grow facial hair, you know, the mustache, the beard, you have the monocle. It's very difficult. It almost blurs in the same way that you say they don't use a doppelganger in the way you think. They have a composite between the original and the new guy. So what remains in your brain from a cognitive perspective is this hybrid. So when we think of Paul McCartney in our minds right now, we're seeing a little bit of the original Paul, you know, with the rounder head, a little shorter, very distinctive look. And then the new one merged together, you know, which is just fascinating that you came up to that. That's a bit of tradecraft, I imagine.
Yes. You mentioned something. You said, what was it you said a moment ago? Could you just, oh, the music? Oh no, what were you saying? I'm sorry, I was a little distracted.
Putting aside like that other people wrote music, do you think their
Oh,
music,
psychedelic.
they also changed, right? So before that, they were known as like the Four Mop Tops. If you their last tour in 1966 and their last gig was at Candlestick Park in San Francisco, it's been demolished now,
Right.
was that performance allegedly. From then on, you know, you'll see the big next impression was made with Sgt. Pepper's, which was a very iconic and transformational album that unleashed, you know, with the Summer of Love, the psychedelic idea, you know, the hippies. And it's, I would analyze from an outside perspective, I would say that would be a brilliant way to introduce a new person. You could airbrush things on the cover. You could shoot those live videos. That's for the first time. Remember, the Beatles stopped touring in 1966. They never played live again. You could say the exception would be on the top of Abbey Road with the rooftop concert, but that was very controlled from a PR perspective. And they did some of those live sessions for the Let It Be movie and album. But they never played to crowds with their original dynamic. And they stopped being kind of all similar in the way they dressed and their haircuts. And now they were going through this kind of psychedelic phase, which acts as a kind of, it's like if you, you know, money laundering, there's idea laundering. And this is a way of like laundering Paul's iconography that they were already exposed to. And then they do very controlled things from then on out. Like they shot like for a Magical Mystery Tour and then maybe for, I want to say Yellow Submarine, but like when you see Fool on the Hill, the videos, you know, those videos they made for some of the singles, whether Strawberry Fields, very psychedelic, walking backwards. They zoom in on the eye, as you mentioned the other day, Claire. And I'm like, is that the evil eye? He has a glass eye. What's going on there? And, but it's almost like in a Masonic way, within the Masonic tradition, there's a kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We're going to show you something for the elect or those that are privy to it, like a wink and a nod to show you things. And I wonder if they've done that in this case. Oh, you've got Tourette's too, I see. See?
No, I deliberately took it off while I'm going to scroll to look for something. But
right,
yeah,
no. It's listen.
it can
half
be
of my
distracting for
jokes will
people.
always fail, Claire. Just know that half of them will always fail. But
I found it again.
So anyway, so
what I was
to
looking
conclude
for.
that, it's just that people should know that when we're talking about a cutoff, we're almost talking about a cutoff directly at the black and white mop top, you know, hello, you know, and then moving into, you know, turn off your mind, relax and float down, you know, like they get very psychedelic. Right. And then some of the people think the songs, obviously, in my opinion, the most clues are in the body of work itself, similar to Shakespeare. I think you just need the music alone. That's their monument, as they would say. That's their monument. But continue, Claire. My apologies.
Okay, so I remember what it was you were saying, which was about the psychedelic era, and I was trying to make a point that is one of that switcheroo, which was it was not just superficial, it was radical. It was beyond what was necessary to make them a slightly psychedelic oriented band because they already were experimenting. It was promoted as something that was going to shock the world. And in fact, it did. And they were very nervous. There's evidence that they were very, very nervous that this wouldn't fly, this wouldn't work. Anyway, the point is that general shift is part of the argument for PID. Again, it comes in as what was the broad swathe of shift where you would expect to find a major shift, you do. But as you brought up, it's also to obscure, from the PID point of view, it's also to obscure the new weird person, okay? Because what you have is if you make everything wonky, people tend to think that the one real wonky thing in it is just part of the general wonkiness, right? So you have this guy and everybody's supposedly now got mustaches, and you've got this new guy and they're all wearing bright colors, and you have a lot of distortions from the lenses, from the perspectives and the fisheye lenses that began to be used. There's the excuse, it's all psychedelic, but we have observed it in very specific situations once we take a careful look at it. So again, yes, the music changed. The issue was Paul to Bill, was that change impossible? Was it not consistent with the way Paul would have changed as he grew? And the more you know Paul, again, as you come to know him, like a person reveals oneself to another person. It's not perfect. We can have famous people that don't fully give us who they are, but we do get a sense of them. We do, if we're careful. And Paul would not have become Bill. Now, what I will say is, aside from the general obscurantism, obscuring this one weird person, this one wrong person among the four, and the general psychedelic era, the fact is that what was I going to say?
Claire,
Mm-hmm.
if I were just listening right now, I would think, I'm not sure what the case is. Okay, so there's different pictures, and the music may be different based on that pivot in the psychedelic era. What else would be contextual to build the argument? Because I do believe it's a fountainhead of circumstantial evidence. It's hard to get the other kind, because this could be a cover-up. I mean, it would require a cover-up, correct?
Right, exactly. So now, yes, everything. What people don't realize is that in a cold case, which is all of history, all evidence is going to be circumstantial. So, for instance, in a court, almost every cold case is actually won by circumstantial evidence. It's a matter of how much you have and whether you have it in each area of the case. It's not actually going to be direct witness testimony, because it's gone cold. And people tend to think that physical forensics are going to close every case. Most cases are not closed by physical forensics.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
What if this is the case, as you hypothesize? It would require an apparatus to maintain this cover-up from then until the present time, right? What do you suggest that is? How many people are in the know? Will they ever tell the truth, or what were their motives for doing this? Why not just announce the death of Paul McCartney? Why would they perhaps take this step of introducing somebody and hoodwinking everybody, in your opinion?
Well, basically, you've got you've got the aspect that in order to do this, it wouldn't be the band. It requires passports. It requires international espionage and so on. So if this is true, whether he's dead or just replaced, if this is true, it requires lies by lawyers, international espionage, passports, etc. So we're already talking about many, many, many people knowing. It actually requires that. Now, the second thing is how many people in the industry know. It becomes very clear after a while that a lot of people knew. And you could say, well, how could that be? Supposedly, if you have a conspiracy of even two people, you're going to have, one of them talking. We do have people talking. That's the thing. We have leaks. We have people who got uncomfortable and hint at it. The problem is they're laughed off. Their testimony is laughed off, but we have it. So for people who are doubting that everybody would have kept quiet, you have to think, well, there are different reasons people keep quiet, and they don't entirely keep quiet. And some actually seem to have been killed for this. In fact, I think it's in the many hundreds. All right. This thing, the way it usually comes out and you asked how many people would have to know, so I'm giving you the answer in the way that is most appropriate. There are many people who talk about it after hours, so shall we speak. Somebody comes along and somebody says, yeah, he's not the same guy. You do know that, right? Okay, that's the typical way these sorts of things are passed on. There's also, of course, people who have spoken in public, and they say, well, you know, I mean, there was that rumor, and yeah, he's not the same guy, is he? And so they do things to make themselves feel good, even in the public eye. But behind the scenes, there's a lot more people knowing. It's an open secret that's a closed secret. Not everyone is told. But my point is, from the point of view of how to do it, it requires state apparatus. Okay, people have to think, this cannot, if this is true, it requires all that other stuff. It's hijacking the state apparatus. So it's the state doing it, sort of like with Kennedy's death. The state does it, possibly on behalf of another state. But there's
what would be the motive
for Paul?
Yeah. I mean, you could speculate, you know, but
I would say this is an area where, unlike his replacement and death and his likely date and circumstances of death, the motives are more speculative.
Okay, well, there's some people that think he got into a car accident and this is them like the show must go on, and they get a new guy and this or that. It's very different to say Paul was assassinated or foul play was at work. So I just want to know, to what degree do we have empirical knowledge or anything, or is it more speculative when we look at those questions?
Well, when I say speculation, I mean, unless I otherwise indicated, I'm not speaking about pure speculation. Okay, we have certain lines of evidence that trail off. So there's several good lines of evidence of where, speculatively speaking, he might have been killed for, or people might have wanted to cover this up. Number one, the Beatles' contribution to Britain's GDP was higher for Britain for 4 years than later the ABBA band was in Sweden in the 70s. And they were bigger than the largest export from Sweden, which was Volvo. So if you think of the general GDP reasons for various politicians, even intelligence services, people in the music industry, whatever, wanting to keep this band thing going, there's that motivation to get people to sign on to a cover-up. That's number one. So there's a money motive to keep it going. Number two, as I showed you, it seems that Paul was beaten up. He was beaten up. They said it was a moped accident, but it was he and another man who was very high up in Irish kind of young politics and so on, which was Tara Brown. Tara Brown was the heir to the Guinness fortune. Right? Okay. These were Irish nobility, basically. They were, there's a whole thing of the Catholic and Protestant thing going on, and the British crown and the Irish thing. All of that is potentially...
That's fascinating, because I think there are parallels to Shakespeare. Again, with Shakespeare, it's a mystery. The popular myth that we're told about the actor Shakespeare is a myth. Shakespeare was something that was closer to the aristocracy and the crown itself. There's many people who speculate whether it's Francis Bacon, the 17th Earl of Oxford, Marlowe, a team of them all working together like the Avengers. But it's interesting because back then, when you were an artist, you were also involved in espionage. You were a poet and you were a spy. And it's interesting because I know the CIA and other intelligence agencies will tap rock stars to be assets of some kind. Why? Because they're on tour.
Yeah.
Think of Bono and U2, and I'm not saying they're doing anything benevolent. Who knows? But you know what I mean. Every once in a while,
you mean malevolent?
Why
they are
malevolent?
They are.
Yeah. Well, listen, U2's doing all like working with Bill Gates and in this kind of, it's like globalist stuff maybe. But think about it. The Beatles at this time were so huge. They were given carte blanche, like they got in trouble there with the Marcos, right? Like was that in Indonesia where the Philippines around there? But they would go and visit heads of state, right? So naturally you would want a handler, at least in their entourage, if they weren't themselves And sometimes this happens through Masonic initiations, like, or just a recruitment into, not saying they're spies or anything, but people will be tapped. You know, it's kind of like Elvis decides to do war propaganda, you know, like, which happened, you know. So that's like something that I think is fascinating, and it ties it back to the days of Shakespeare. And also Billy Shears is William Shears of Shakespeare. So there are a lot of like wordplay involved. And I just wanted to add that. Keep going.
Okay, so yeah, just so you may know, I don't know if you've ever read this book. It's the very best book on the Shakespeare conspiracy. It's called Shakespeare Conspiracy. I'm not sure if it's even in print anymore because it was so good that it got panned by people, even people who were into the various conspiracy options, because their ideas no longer work. What these people discovered, and I'll just run down, is that Shakespeare, the basic issue with Shakespeare is that there's great evidence that it actually was a person, not a group. But the problem is, and there are people who dispute that, but they don't have good arguments. Okay, but the issue is there's problems in the records of what Shakespeare supposedly was doing in London, and then what was going on elsewhere in the historical documentary evidence.
Right.
So, for instance, he's buying a house here, but he's dirt poor over here, and in the same year, and this kind of stuff. So, what they do is they take that historical, again, what is your best evidence? It's always several lines of evidence coming together.
Right.
Okay? So what they do is they show that, I'll give you the upshot, that he actually was a spy who was recruited, but he was Catholic, but he was recruited. And ultimately he got into the, there was the Catholic Protestant spycraft of Elizabeth I and all of that.
Right.
And he wasn't comfortable with all of it, but he was involved. And they show actually, even in some cryptography, it's absolutely fascinating what they've discovered.
Hold on that subject, because we could do a whole episode on the Shakespeare thing. That's one of my favorite subjects.
Yeah. So I want to get back to Paul, but in fact, Shakespeare is probably what they're playing on.
Yes.
In the Billy Shears aspect, in the music. Having said that, it's also Billy Shear, right? Okay, so it's a kind of a, but that doesn't mean they even knew. See, we have to be careful. Shakespeare was seen as possibly an asset, or maybe a different lord or whatever, and the Beatles themselves could have not known the actual story that these two, Martin Keatman and Graham Phillips, came up with in 1995. They simply probably were playing with what was, what the weirdness of it, or the doubling, or that. Now, I'm not saying they didn't know. I'm just saying they didn't have to know to be using that reference.
Right.
So we were talking about Paul and Bill and their character, who they are. What do they represent themselves as? Now, I have on screen right now a photo of Bill. We have several photos of Bill posing, picking his nose, posing, coughing on people, whatever, posing in ugly poses. Paul never did that. He was very classy. Does that mean he didn't sometimes joke or get mean? No, I'm not saying he was never mean. I'm not saying he was Mr. Perfect, but he tended to like classiness. Even in his psychedelic suits in the 1966, 1965, he'd wear big polka dots, but he still had a nice suit, right? Bill is a notoriously generally bad dresser. He's now, this is a faked photo. I could go through how it was faked exactly, but on the screen here we have Paul, and we have certain parts of the photo are exact matches of the earlier photo.
Okay. Would you mind if go on, sorry.
Right. So you can actually see a bit of the original line of there's an original line of the lip here with the exact shadow that they put in, but then they have a little bit of the new shadow. They have exactly the parts of the cheek. They have the mouth closed here, but all you have to do is take this lip and then in a studio, you don't have to have a computer to do this. This is what people don't realize. You can do it in a photo A lot of this stuff was done in a Photoshop, in photo studios, right? Where you expose the paper to part of the negative, right? So part of the negative's cut off, and then you expose the other half or portion to the other part of the negatives. You
Do you have something to look at so it's less abstract?
Can you see my screen there?
No, let's see. No.
Oh crap! Oh, so this whole time I was speaking. And
I'm sorry. It's okay.
No. Let me stop. And
how about you look for it? I want to play that video that I interrupted because it might have. Let's watch that again. It's only a couple minutes long, and you find on your screen the other thing.
Yeah, I got it. It was just that I didn't.
I still want to play this video because I feel so bad. I didn't.
Okay, and here's the on the nose here, and here's the faked photo with aspects that were the same between two photos.
Right, those guys look totally different. If I'm being honest,
they do superficially, but they actually it's actually faked photo. They've taken this part of the brow and put it over here.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah.
They've got exactly this upper lip, but they've moved this lip up to match it. They've got, see what my point is, you'd say, well, or it's the same person, but it isn't. It's exact photo likenesses, if that makes sense. So anyway, you wanted to play something else?
Oh, I just wanted to play that video again. And then we'll get right back into it.
Okay.
So for anybody just joining late or whatever, this is the video I played at the beginning that I cut short a little bit.
In the annals of rock and roll lore, few tales match the eerie and enduring enigma of the Paul is Dead conspiracy. It's a story that's persisted for over half a century, woven into the fabric of one of the most iconic bands in history, the Beatles. This legend posits a chilling scenario. Paul McCartney, the charismatic bassist and co-lead vocalist of the Beatles, died in 1966 and was replaced by a look-alike. The roots of this urban legend trace back to 1966. It was an era of Beatlemania, where the Fab Four not only dominated the charts, but also the collective consciousness of the youth. The rumor, seemingly born out of thin air, began its eerie whisper across college campuses and into the mainstream media by September 1969. Central to this bewildering theory was a specific tragic event, Paul McCartney's death in a car crash. According to the lore, this catastrophic event claimed McCartney's life, setting the stage for one of the most enigmatic tales in music history. In an effort to shield the public from the immense grief this news would surely cause, the surviving Beatles purportedly, with the assistance of Britain's MI5, embarked on a covert operation to replace McCartney with a look-alike. This extraordinary claim transformed the way fans listened to the Beatles' music and viewed their album covers. Clues were allegedly embedded in these elements, suggesting the truth about McCartney's fate. Enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists meticulously analyzed lyrics and scrutinized cover art, convinced that the band was communicating the dark secret through subtle, cryptic messages. By October 1969, this pursuit of hidden truths had escalated beyond a mere hobby for a few curious fans. It became an international phenomenon, captivating Beatles enthusiasts across the globe. People delved into the band's discography with an almost forensic attention to detail, seeking out any hint or symbol that could be linked to the supposed car crash and McCartney's replacement. This global fascination highlighted not just the enduring impact of the Beatles, but also the allure of mystery and the compelling nature of collective myths. The Paul is Dead conspiracy, fueled by the tragic imagery of McCartney's alleged car crash, wove itself into the very fabric of Beatles lore, becoming an unforgettable chapter in the saga of the world's most famous rock band.
Oh, I'm so sorry that I cut that short before. But yeah, that's the context. And it's interesting. There's a lot of different directions. We both looked into this, and people will disagree like they do in any, in the JFK, 9/11, other research communities. But it's fascinating. And next time we talk, Claire, you're going to talk about the Roman Catholicism element, which I found fascinating. And I look forward to that. So what else besides what we've talked about, which is focused on what they do with images, how they could have, used camouflage to obscure the change in stylistic things within the music. But what do we know about? Is there anything we know about 1966 specifically? Are we making inferences based on these people kind of look and sound different? Just what other, like, if you had to have on like one hand, like the 5 strongest, the best evidence, what would that for you be? What other things?
Well, I don't play the so-called best evidence game. But what I will say is there's photos, but you have to be careful. You have to know what you're doing. There's audio issues with the way they speak and the way they present themselves visually, their whole body language.
You're basically saying that we have all this, epistemic uncertainty. So how will anybody know if everything? No, I'm asking for viewers, because you're basically saying, you can't look at the photos because there might be faked. You have to know the provenance of the photo. You have to do very careful things. But what makes this for you? What convinced you specifically to pursue this?
Okay, well, that's a different question than what are the best areas of evidence. I wasn't saying you have to know an exact provenance of a photo. I'm saying you have to get to know Paul. Right. When you get to know Paul and you sift out the time period, you say, look, this is supposed to have happened around 66. So let's make a division there and try it out. Let's look at the man. Let's look at his body type, the way he acts, what he's doing. Now, we also have to be aware there will be fakes in it if this is true. Okay. So then we say, well, this looks like maybe a fake photo. This looks like maybe a fake photo. And of course, if you're actually good with fake photos, you can tell a lot of them. All right. And then you say, what about the guy after, supposedly the Sir Paul character that we're positing, right? How does he behave? What did people say about him? What's happening? So that is the big issue for making the division, for seeing, right? You should begin to know more about it. I would say another line of argument, as I said, is what I'm showing on screen. Does it show false rumor there and mustaches all around?
So explain the context of what we're looking at. This is something that was printed in one of their fan magazines, correct? And it basically says, this is a false rumor. Don't pay attention. But it basically says there was a rumor about Paul McCartney having been killed in a car crash.
Right.
And then right below that, it says mustaches all around. All the boys decided, and so already you have a transition to, we need to put mustaches on everybody,
Right. And I don't know how to get rid of the bar at the top, but I wanted to say this was This was early 1967. This was February 1st, I believe, 1967. He was supposed to have been dead. I mentioned this earlier in late 66. That's when his photos changed and everything went wonky. Now, this is not just a fan magazine. This is an official outlet fan magazine. So this was run through the people who were very close to the Beatles. And they put out that there was this rumor already in early February 67.
It's just important that people understand there's a reason why people back then thought it was a thing, because there was evidence, and
they didn't know this. My point is, they didn't know this. This was discovered in the late 90s, that this had been put out. It was not well known. It was not part of the 1969-70 flap. Nobody knew it had started back then. That was people.
Right. This was very early, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it's long before the official story.
I agree.
Now, what I noticed in your little clip is that we have done a good enough job of getting the word out there that this thing exists, that it actually is very early attestation historically that there was at least the planting or the existence of a rumor, and this is an early awkward denial of it, okay? Or it was planted then. We've done such a good job of getting the word out that even that little disinformational sort of sneaky thing that you played, where it has fake photos of Bill and all of these things in it, even they had to say it had developed by 1969, and they did flash this image. They flashed false rumor. That's only because we, the conspiracy theorists, and I say that as a technical term, got the word out. It is so well known now among some that it didn't start in 69.
You haven't mentioned other things like his wife, Heather Mills, suggesting that this was the case. A lot of
Right,
other evidence, you know.
Well, that's a whole other line, as I said, is other people speaking about it. What did they say? When do people speak? So as I said, this is very important for historic. If you realize that for 30, 40 years, there was no supposed evidence that it was anything other than college students,
Right.
and a man found this,
we
right?
spent 20 minutes going over the college students. Let me explain the Heather Mills thing to people. Paul McCartney was married to this beautiful woman, Heather Mills, and at one point she was fearing for her life, and she said she had a box of evidence that she would put out if anything ever happened to her, blah blah blah. This made, like, you know, a lot of, you know, went on the circles of the talk shows, and it was a big deal, and then no one ever really brings it up again. But there are other examples of other musicians, other people speaking out that add to that fountainhead of circumstantial evidence.
Right. And she actually said quite a bit more that was very significant. It was clear she was terrified. And was she a manipulative person too? Yes, but there's actually a lot about that. I was simply bringing up the fact that it's not whether it was college students. The fact is that if it starts very, very early, then
we got that point. I think we should get together and do this soon, and I'll prepare a bunch of slides, and we'll show people some of the best evidence, from Heather Mills saying this to other people saying that.
Sure, but we didn't get into what might have killed him. Okay, so I think we should finish that thought.
Okay.
So for a long time, it wasn't even supposed that he might have been murdered. But when you know these kinds of situations where it's a great big cover up, people began wondering. So as you mentioned earlier, one of the lines is that Paul was reported by Mark Lane, who was involved in some disinformation, but also good information about the JFK assassination, that Paul had offered to him. They'd met several times. He gives detailed descriptions of meeting him and the circumstances, and then says that he was going to try to help with this movie coming out in late '66 for the JFK assassination, filmed in Dallas. And Paul shows up dead right about then. Now, Mark Lane doesn't say that, but I'm saying that there's that issue. However, he had this supposed moped accident, which looks like he was beaten up before that in December 1965 with Tara Brown. So what was going on there? What were they being beaten up for? That's a question. Okay, probably wasn't JFK issues, but it could have been. Then you have people who know about the occultery, sacrificial, witchcraft, and possibly child abuse aspects of in the not only music industry, but in some aspects of elitism. And that maybe the Beatles found out about this and they were getting upset and Paul was going to say something. Then I'll
bring up an example. The heir to the Getty fortune was kidnapped around that time. There was a huge thing. He came back safely, but his ear was cut off. So it wasn't unusual for people that were prominent in the aristocratic social circles to have terrible things happen to them for reasons that are unknown. But that's another example that there were things happening.
If they want to go against it, or they start making a ripple, or they're inconvenient to somebody, or they whatever. This is the thing: is that this case, it doesn't. It absolutely requires a large formal cover up. Okay, to do it. It also, then you're dealing with all these other things. Which thing was the thing that got him killed? Well, it may have been several. It may have been several motivations as he became more upset about the JFK thing. That might have been the thing that everybody agreed to kill him for.
Right.
However, there is a crossover between him and another person that not everyone would know of.
That's what we're going to talk about next time, if it's where you think you're going. And listen, I want to do a better job myself in terms of laying out things maybe in a linear way, because we're so we're like on a PhD level with this stuff. We forget that, like, people need to understand cause and effect. Here's another example. Neil Aspinall, when he died.
Tell the audience who Neil Aspinall is, though.
You go ahead. But when he died, it basically said on The Guardian, you could look this up and Google it now, his obituary. He was head of Apple.
He was a roadie.
He was originally their roadie in the old days, went with them everywhere along with Mal Evans, who was shot to death here where I live in Los Angeles. It's a part of this thing. It's very much like JFK, where witnesses and people who know too much kind of disappear. So Neil Aspinall, like in the Guardian obituary, it says, so and so, this august man who reigned over this empire of the Beatles, was there from the beginning to the end, dies and takes mysterious secrets with him, or takes his secrets with him. And that's an obituary. So that's like, family are going to read it. I talked to the London Times when my father passed away. So,
and they didn't say the weird PID thing. They say the secrets. Like, no, they don't have to say that.
But it's hinting. This is what I mean by wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Exactly.
So that I add that to the Heather Mills, and so there's a constellation of things like that. I'm going to write that down next time we talk. Because for these fun things like the Paul this narrative, which I love, and the Shakespeare one, I'm going to do it as part of this segment called Interludes, where we could talk about fun things like Operation Stargate, things like that. And then the other stuff is going to be more educational and about reforming national security. But I want to do this where we go deeper next time. We talk about the church angle and I'll leave it as a surprise too. But this is just a taste and a tease, an introduction that you might feel this is a bridge too far. Like, I don't know, man. And I hear you. Whenever you're first confronted with something that is not part of what you're internalized. And listen, I was a bass player because of Paul McCartney. I'm named after him, James Paul McCartney. Like, I don't have skin in the game that things are not the way that I imagine them, because the Beatles were like how I got into rock music, or my favorite thing to sing at karaoke. And that's probably what got Clare involved, is that we love the Beatles. So it brings me whatever, if there's any scandal or anything, it's just like with anything that we research, we need to report the truth and be honest when I'm sketchy on this. I know for sure, because I think when we bring evidence and we put it in front of people, they can make up their own mind. That's why I want to meditate on this idea of, I agreed, like, best evidence is a little much, but, we can compile some of these things and make that sort of little mini video that we can't find on YouTube because it's so filled with the propaganda versions, as Claire told me. And I found out that to be true. And go through it. And I'll go through the music because I just think the music has it tells the whole story.
Well, first of all, on the screen here, I have some doctored photos. You can see there's a natural photo here with Paul, but there's a doctoring into Bill's face over here. They've picked exact things from the previous photo to match it. You also have different ways that it's been doctored in different photos. I just wanted to show people the level of weirdness that Bill begins to get into, where they're doctoring things in Bill's face. He's not the same guy, but they've tried to make him into kind of a same guy. Now, he aged like this. Would Paul have aged like that? No, he would have aged, but he would have aged differently. That's the issue. Now, in terms of the music, there's one final thing I'll say if you're planning to end the stream soon. It's that there are a couple of songs which Paul sang on, particularly one where he sang, and we can cover this next time, but they were put out posthumously. So they're on the later albums, but they're not Bill. And this is one thing that they did also, in honoring him, but also to confuse the record, meaning the historical record, but also the audio phonograph record. Okay. So She's Leaving Home. She's Leaving Home is Paul. We actually even have the original recording of Paul, and it's Paul. It's the same. They've doctored it up a little bit to make it sound shinier, but it is Paul. We have all kinds of background now that a friend of mine has gathered on weirdness around that song, and we know that one was Paul. Also, Fool on the Hill, we have an original recording. Paul obviously did actually sing a version, but Bill sang over it or re-sang it or something. So Paul did write and record She's Leaving Home and Fool Fool may have been more doctored, okay, and it's on the later thing. And then also Her Majesty, which is a little ditty that was put into a record with no name. It's not officially on the album, and it actually was supposed to be the very last thing the Beatles ever produced. That little
Can I play She's Leaving Home?
If you do it, you might get flagged, but you could.
Well, it's okay.
Play a piece.
What are they gonna do? Yeah, I'll just play a piece.
It's so beautiful, but it was modified after, and I'd like to talk next time about that.
Yeah. Let's see. Is it muted?
And then they have Sgt. Pepper's album cover on it.
Oh, there we go.
Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock as the day begins.
They've remastered it to sound a little less like Paul.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I don't want to play too much of it, but I just wanted them to know which song.
It doesn't sound as much like Paul as it used to. Why don't you stop it?
You know, he doesn't have that kind of vibe that Paul has, you know, like this is just my vibe, you know, it's not like anything serious, but it's you know, like Martha, My Dear, he had this very vaudeville. Stupid. This guy has a very vaudeville, like la-di-da, like, you know, Paul was a little bit edgier in his own way, but
not gross, edgy.
Sir Paul tends to be a little he might be a homosexual, you know, like I'm not saying that.
Yeah, I think he's bi. Yeah.
Yeah, he might be, but he's a little bit flamboyant. I could see him dressing up as Liberace, you know, just like Martha. It's just very funny, that guy. He's too over the top. He's like, I think he's a ham. He's a little bit of a ham in his acting. What do you think?
Yeah, except that in the other sense, Paul was more of a ham in the other sense, where we use it to mean a real friendly guy who would play and
they'd make
laughter
jokes, like
and fun, that kind of a ham.
Like, especially the wit. He had wit. If you see recordings, and we should pull that one up for next time, Paul McCartney had a sharp wit. He'd have a rejoinder to anything the press was asking him. Very brilliant guy, smart guy. So what else? Like, what should we end on for now? And then we'll take this up in a larger episode, and we're going to add the spiritual angle, the church angle, and all the other things we didn't get to, because I see this as kind of a teaser in a way.
Well, I would add that there are some misleading or confusing elements that have always been present since the time of the internet, making this more popular as an idea. And some of those ideas have probably some truth to them. The problem is that they don't have all truth to them. And we have people adhering to, you know, making idols out of people who've spoken on this issue. And I don't want to be anybody's idol. I don't want others to be people's idols. I want them to look at the reasonableness of the cases made for various things in this. Like, for instance, were there multiple doubles everywhere, or is it basically Paul? Did the Beatles write all their own music? Some of it. Did they have time to write their own music? Turns out they do, but there are people claiming they didn't. But even if they did have time, did they write their own music? Is there a personal element of the Beatles? Can you get to know them in a way? Like, are they just complete?
I know you're avoiding all the pitfalls that people can go down, but it would be like if you're trying to tell the story of 9/11 and you're like, listen, you're going to hear about holograms. Some people are going to say it's mini nukes over here. Some people are going to say it's directed energy weapons. Some people, you know what I mean? Where sometimes you can just go like, there's only been 3 skyscrapers that have ever fallen to the ground in the history of the world, and those are the 2 towers and the other one. So do you know what I mean? Like, and then nothing falls at free fall speed. But those things, like anything that has an, especially empirically proven by science, that's why the magic bullet theory became so popular in the JFK case, because it begged credulity, right? Begged credulity. And so I think this is cognitively challenging to get people to wrap their head around it, if that makes sense. Because they have their opinions, you know?
Well, you're right. You asked me for my final thoughts. I mean, I did want to leave the audience with a sense that as they go snurfling around trying to search stuff, they will run into mistakes. They will run into different ideas. But the final thought I would leave them with is, if this is true, okay, it requires the big conspiracy type thing that people are saying was involved in the COVID situation or in the JFK situation. What the case does is it says the normal business and normal government and normal all of that stuff, normal passports, they exist. They don't not exist, but that the conspirators hijack those things.
So we have to add to that. There's other evidence, such as Sir Paul refused to get tested when, there's out of wedlock pregnancies. And it's believed that Paul McCartney, they have groupies, they were rock stars. Sometimes those turn into unwanted pregnancies that happen, and they find out about the child later. And sometimes this is handled discreetly by the estate or the corporation that owns Apple, maybe to keep people quiet or whatnot. One person came forward and demanded, and then there's things like that too. I just wanted to add that briefly, and we'll talk about it again next time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's, as I say, there's so many lines of evidence to this, but the overarching is, if it's possible, then there's aspects of cover up that people have run into in every area, whether it's children who are trying to prove a parentage, or whether it's people trying to look at photos, or people trying to take a photo and then their photo is doctored. And did they know? I mean, all of that's going to be true. And so to say, is it possible? It cannot be just the band. It requires too much. And whether or not you know exactly how it was done, or you know how the family felt or whatever at a given point, the reality is these big conspiracies simply hijack normal international operations. So it's not as though it's impossible.
So it might,
all of the
there might be a
there.
military intelligence or clandestine part of the state that would be involved to pull this off in such a, because he's one of the largest stars in the world. So we'll get into that next time, and just leave us with your last closing thoughts. And thank you for talking to me tonight. And I think this is a fascinating subject, and I can't wait to lay it out for people.
Okay, well, my closing thought is, if this is true, and it is really sad. It's sick. It's basically a person who is the first public identity theft in history that we know of. Nothing like this had been done before. Pieces of it had been done before. This had not been done before. And whether you like or you don't like Beatles, or you're upset at them, it's absolutely awful. And most of the deception is self-deception. Once you actually look at it and understand it, it's not that unclear.
So if you can get over your initial skepticism and look at the evidence.
Yeah, this one is true. There are other things that aren't. I recognize that, but this one's true. But you will run into some problems as you begin to learn about it. And I just did want people to know it's a tragedy beyond a tragedy, not because it was an accident. And other people have died for it too. But yeah, so
next time we'll play the clip from The Shining, which I think all that stuff is fascinating too. Well, anyway, yeah, there's so much we're gonna do, but thank you, God bless you, and thanks for introducing us to this. And it's a lot to think about. And will you please come back and let's do this in a longer format, where we can show all of we can show some of the clues for fun, but all the important things that we talked about, because it might be, I think it's this idea of a constellation of evidence.
Yes. And in fact, that's a good point, is that the clues is everything, meaning everything is a clue. As they say, a ham sandwich is evidence in court if you have a reason to show it. And people say, well, that's not physical forensics. Actually, that would be for physical forensics if it's relevant. So the point is, historically speaking, you have to look at everything. You don't stop looking, but you do start filtering, knowing what is good evidence after a while, if you're careful. And you're either dealing with a dead body that was disappeared, or and several of them, or you're not. And that's what this entails. So thank you,
Well,
James. And
thank you very much. And we'll do this right away as soon as we can. We both had technical things that we were working on today. Thank you for being patient. And
thank
we
you,
got to give
everybody.
people a little teaser. It's a teaser. So God bless everybody. Thank you so much, Claire. And I will talk to you soon.
Okay. Thanks, James. Thank you very much for contacting me to do this.
God bless. All right, everybody. I hope everybody has a wonderful evening. This is just coming soon, a little longer coming soon than I was planning on, but it's just fun talking about these subjects. So have a wonderful night, and we'll dive into this in one of our traditional episodes. Have a good night.